This podcast contains stories from survivors of mother and baby homes. Some listeners may find this upsetting.
Hey Chris.
Alan, how are you?
I'm good. You?
Yeah, good. Alan, have a listen to this.
As I'm standing in the kitchen of our home in Wexford, I hear my mother on the phone and I hear her saying, "Yes, sister, it's a moral problem." That's me. That's what I am. That's my definition now. I'm not Deirdre, the daughter you're proud of. I am a moral problem.
So that's the voice of Deirdre Wadding. Deirdre was a survivor of the mother and baby home system. And what she's describing there is the moment when, in her mind, she ceased being a daughter and became a moral problem. And what you did with moral problems then is you hid them away. And she was sent into a system that's the focus of a report that was published just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, this report was commissioned in 2015, Chris, but largely following public outcry after a local historian in Tuam in County Galway, Catherine Corliss, she did incredible research into the mother and baby home in Tuam. And one of the lines of research she followed was into the burial records of the babies and the children who died at the home. It became very apparent to Catherine quite quickly that the dead were not given proper burials. It seems that a lot of the dead were buried in an unused wastewater system on the site.
No one intervened on behalf of...
So on today's HedgeRadio Podcast, we're going to hear Deirdre's story, and she's going to give us an insight into the secrecy and just the lengths that society went to hide these women away.
And we're also going to look at the historical mistreatment of women and children in state care. As it turns out, unfortunately, we have form in treating women pretty poorly.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Alan.
This is the HedgeRadio Podcast.
Stay and have a listen.
So there was a lot of anticipation around the publication of the Mother and Baby Home report. But when it was published, it was so poorly received by the survivors. It just seemed that the state got it wrong again. And it just left me wondering why. Why are we still getting this so wrong?
I think when a report like this comes out, Chris, it often reports on a moment in time or an event. But what we've discovered is that here in Ireland, we have a history of treating women pretty poorly. And I think Deirdre's story speaks to that.
I phoned Deirdre and she very kindly agreed to give us a remarkable insight into that mother and baby home system, but
Hiya.
for Deirdre into a very difficult period in her own life.
You think back to it and you go, 1981, well, it wasn't the dark ages. Surely people were a bit more clued in, a bit more aware. But really, I think what younger people don't realise is how repressed society still was. You couldn't, access contraception easily even then. And my own particular family were very Catholic. Now, my dad was always a kind of questioning man, but he was very much a devout Catholic. But my mother was I don't know if I can put it this way, sort of a fearful Catholic, if you know what I mean. It was all about sin and all the rest.
Would you say your father would have been kind of like a cultural Catholic?
No, no. Like my father would have been a man who was very, very sincere in his faith. He would have gone to Mass pretty much every day because it gave him joy. And I can relate to that as someone who's I'm a pagan now, and probably not surprisingly. But for me, my spirituality is just part of who I am. It's not a thing I do only on ceremonial occasions. And for my dad, his Catholicism was that. It was part of the fabric of his being. He was a spiritual man. What he did have in those days was that kind of old-fashioned, that's women's business kind of thing. So that when I did come home and tell both of them that I was pregnant. Now, he did react, and it was hurtful when he reacted because I think he got such a shock. But he sort of stepped to one side and let my mother deal with it.
Did you sit them down? Were you were obviously, this was running around in your head for a while, you know, to actually tell them. Do you remember the moment?
Well, do you know what, Chris? It probably seems absolutely crazy now to hear this, you know, for a girl of 18, but I thought I was sick or something. It never crossed my mind that I was pregnant. Why, I don't know, but it just didn't. I was a bit clueless. Like, I mean, I honestly didn't think I was pregnant. I thought I had something wrong with me. And I was throwing up, and I had fainted a couple of times, which wasn't like me. You know, I wasn't someone who fainted. And so I think I was home on the Christmas holidays, and I went to the doctor. My mother was anxious because I'd been sick, you know, for a couple of months. And so when I came home to the doctor, from the doctors, I mean, I was in absolute shock, like, because I just thought, oh my God, like, what are they going to say? But it never crossed my mind in that walk back from the doctors to our home that anything would happen except that I'd have a child, you know?
Okay, yeah.
And when I came in the door, my mother was waiting there. She went, well, you know, and I just looked at her and I said, I'm pregnant. And the response was just so severe. I mean, to this day, it might sound overly dramatic, but I truly believed then that she would have been happier if I'd come in and said, oh, Mum, I have cancer.
Wow.
That was how it felt, you know, that would have been preferable.
Yeah.
Geez, Chris, I think you're almost stunned silence. Deirdre's story is quite, her mother's reaction is quite drastic.
Yeah, and I think what's important, and what Deirdre was kind of setting up at the beginning, is what society was like at the time. And her parents were very Catholic, and really the norms of society and what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable, that was set by the Catholic Church and had been for decades.
I know, and which is of course one of the things the commission, this report we spoke about in the beginning, we noticed there's about 300 or 400 pages at the end of the report of witness stories, other people like Deirdre, and just a little bit like, I was drawn to one of a 15-year-old girl who got pregnant with a boyfriend. She went home to her mother and she just said her bags were packed and she was run out of the house. And she thought, I'm trying to make it easy, but she went back to the UK, but there was a priest became involved, was her words, and before she knew it, she was being picked up at a railway station by a nun and being escorted to a mother and baby home. And when she arrived, she was told, you're here for your sins.
Yeah, and what kind of shocked Deirdre as well was that change that she saw, because she grew up, she says, like, her mum was very loving, her father as well, everything was quite happy, but the change that came over when this news was brought into the house was quite profound.
She became, out of her own fear and reaction and fear for me, I suppose, you know, she became very verbally abusive to me and called me names, and, you know, it was horrendous. It was just horrendous. It was horrendous. And it was a desperately traumatic moment. It's something that never left me, to be honest, because it's not like my mother was a very harsh person with me before that. And it was like suddenly this person that you thought was your kind of main support and who was always going to be there for you turned into this sort of ranting, abusive stranger before your very eyes. You know, so what that trauma did, I think, was to kind of make me internalize all of that and go, oh my God, look at what this has done to my mother. I am an awful person. This is a terrible thing. You know, the guilt, the shame of like doing this, like, to them. it just seeped in. It was this desperate guilt and shame that I had internalized, which made me believe that I had to make amends, that I had to do what they wanted me to do to sort of be a good girl again, to make up for this awful thing I had done to them. And that was how I saw it. I had done this to them, you know? And so in any discussions about, you know, but what if I kept my child? That was like never a runner. That was always, where would you live, was something my mother said to me. And instead of like, you know, I think about it now, like I was absolutely forbidden to speak to my sister. And like we talk about it now, my sister and I, and she goes, I'd have gone, what do you mean? Like I can't. But my personality was such that when she said, where would you live? Inside me, I just go, okay, so clearly I can't live here. And I did, like there was a stage where I considered suicide. I just thought, like, just end everything. And the fact that I was carrying a child is the only thing that stopped me at that point.
So while Deirdre was trying to get her head around everything, her mother had taken complete control of the situation. And Deirdre had an aunt who was a nun.
And my mother rang her superior. And I was in the kitchen at the time. And I've repeated this so many times, talking over the last few weeks. And still, there's that absolute churning, like in my stomach when I say this. As I'm standing in the kitchen of our home in Wexford, I hear my mother on the phone, and I hear her saying, yes, sister, it's a moral problem. And it's like that kind of just lightning bolt going, that's me, that's what I am. That's my definition now. I'm not Deirdre, the daughter you're proud of. I am a moral problem.
This is a tough place for an 18-year-old girl to find herself. She's listening to her mother describe her as a moral problem. To be a problem or an object that needs to be dealt with cannot be easy.
Yeah, and at this point, like, Deirdre's obviously been sworn to secrecy. Her life in college, there's a story gone out. She can still go up during the week. She has to be home every weekend. There's a new cover story being put out. The decision has been taken that she's going to Bessborough Mother and Baby Home in Cork. And when she gets there, not only is the place itself going to be frightening for a young girl going through all this, but she's also going to lose her name.
Yeah, my dad brought me down and, you know, brought me up through, can still see those big, like, actually it's amazing the impact it still has. When I see a photo now of Bessborough, of that part of the building, the big old convent part, you know, where the nuns were, and the steps up to the big wooden doors, it just, I get a chill, like, even when I see a photo of it. But, you know, you were given a house name, it was called. So your house name, in the old days, I think they just told you you're Francis or you're Mary or whatever. In 1981, it was, well, you know, to protect people's privacy, it'd be kind of how it was put. People don't use their own names here, so you can choose a name that you kind of will use while you're here. And I chose Ciara because just it sounded a bit like Deirdre, and it was Irish, which kind of mattered to me. I walk in through those great big wooden doors, and there's a nun there, and, you know, she was pleasant enough, and she just said, you know, about the name. And so now I was Ciara, and then I was brought across the yard to a different part of the building and shown where, like, the dining room was and the common room, and then upstairs to a bedroom, and there were 2 beds in it, and the other girl in the room was 13 years old.
So, Chris, we're going to come back to Deirdre's story in a little while, but we do want to talk about what inspired us to even get in touch with Deirdre.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a historian in Tuam called Catherine Corliss who did Trojan work over a number of years into the mother and baby home in Tuam. And one of the things that had been found in Tuam were skeletal remains in a disused wastewater system. And what Catherine Corliss did was she tracked down the death certs for all the babies and children that died in Tuam and realised that they didn't have burial records to match. And it seems obvious that a lot of the babies and the children were buried in this disused septic tank system. So I really wanted to figure out now at this point is, how did we get to the point as a society where we're thinking, you know what, it's okay to put babies and children into a disused wastewater system rather than afford them a proper burial. And I contacted Dr. Linda Lynch. Dr. Linda Lynch is an osteoarchaeologist who studies human remains in burial situations. And I really wanted to ask Linda, what is the history of how we treat our dead in Ireland and what respect that we give them, just in an effort to try and understand why these religious orders who were running mother and baby homes got to the point in their own culture and their own way of thinking that it was okay to put a dead baby or a dead child in a wastewater system.
We have fallen in treating people quite poorly in burial sometimes. That, you know, certain sectors of society were certainly, like, they were ostracised in life and then they were ostracised in death as well. That has a long tradition. It changes over time, you know, depending on who's going to be the target this century. But, you know, certainly in the 19th century would have been paupers. Literally, the poor were the ones that were targeted.
So what Linda's explaining there is that when she says we have form, in the 19th century, just to be poor was enough then for the authorities to have this excuse to treat you in terrible ways throughout life and into death. And it seems then that in the 20th century, that attitude was just transferred to mother and children.
I always recall hearing stories of people who had taken their own lives not being buried in graveyards, in consecrated ground, that the church priests wouldn't allow it. And I've learned now from Linda that went further than just people who took their own lives. It applied also to stillborn children, unbaptized children, and even mothers who died in childbirth. And Linda goes into much more detail. She explains these children's burial grounds, which are known as Killeens.
There's a site that I was lucky to work on that was known as a Killeen, or that term children's burial ground, where it was used for the burial of you know, young infants and older children, and suicides would have been buried there as well, and women who weren't churched. The teaching of the church was that if once a woman gave birth, she would have to be, because it was perceived as being unclean. Now, I'm not a, you know, theological expert, but she was perceived as being unclean, and she would have to go through a ceremony, a religious ceremony that would literally cleanse her and allow her to come back into the church itself. So if a woman gave birth, and if she died before that ceremony could take place, then technically she could not be buried in consecrated ground. And certainly that was certainly practiced up to the 1960s, at least in Ireland.
And there was no such fate for a man?
I don't believe so, no. It's the fear of women and the you know, women and sex and sin and all that. It was all just lumped in together.
These people were unremarkable and didn't deserve to be buried in consecrated ground. But when we find these burial remains, we see how the community treated their dead and the respect that they afforded to them in their own community.
With Killeen, although they're cemeteries that are for the burial of individuals who would be denied burial in consecrated ground. The sites themselves are often very, very highly regarded by communities. They were seen as, this is the place where the babies are all kept, and they were respected, the sites themselves.
In the past, when the church turned around and said, no, you cannot bury your dead in this consecrated ground, the community themselves had these spaces, these Kilini, where they could bury their dead and they could honour their dead and show that respect that we value so much in Irish society. But Catherine Corliss's work has shone a light on how this wasn't afforded to the children and babies that died in the mother and baby homes.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, Chris, that even in the Commission's report in the last couple of weeks, they noted that the religious institutions are still not affording that respect to the survivors. And the Commission noted that it finds it very difficult to understand that no member of the congregation was able to say where the children who died in Bessborough are buried.
Yeah, it just seems incredible, and I put this to Linda about how was the church in such a vacuum that they decided this was okay, enabled by the state. The state acquiesced to the church's wishes around the running of the mother and baby homes. Is that just a culture that they maybe would have felt like, well, this is okay?
It certainly seems to be a carry on to some degree of previous, I suppose, ways in how people in institutions who died in institutions, of how they were treated in death. It's the context of those burials that it does appear to be some type of wastewater treatment structure that they were disposed of in or buried in, and that's, I suppose, that's what's reverberating with so many people is the horror of that it's, there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of individuals buried unnamed in institutions, dating back a few centuries. We know that, but it's the context of where these particular individuals are is the key here, that it's almost on another level of disrespect.
We left Deirdre and she had just arrived at Bessborough.
I was probably about 6 months or just past the 6 months then. It was basically get me away before I would really show.
Okay.
And not like now. In those days I was a skinny malink, so I didn't show for a good while.
Her first few nights she spent with that 13-year-old girl. As you can imagine, Alan, this was just compounding her own trauma.
It's good to remember, Deirdre at this time is 18 and she's just been sent here. She's been disowned almost by her own family.
And Deirdre, did you talk to anyone? Was there anyone you could talk to? I know you were strictly forbidden.
No, nobody. I talked to nobody at that point at all. Nobody. I mean, in one way, that was one thing. I always say that if there was any positive to be found about being in Bessborough, it was the solidarity among the young women there. Because they're okay, we're all in the same boat. Everyone's pregnant, everyone's banished, everyone's carrying this guilt and hiding away and this imposed secrecy. So we could talk among ourselves, we could support each other.
Yeah.
So finally there was that kind of sense of being able to speak freely about, your pregnancy, about your feelings, about all of that.
Yeah.
But what you didn't talk about was, where you came from. You could talk about your family and your dynamics and all that, but you wouldn't say where you were from exactly. You might say the county. That'd be about it.
Okay.
And part of our chores was like staffing the nursery, and that was a really difficult one emotionally, because it was lovely, we'd all be in there together and you'd be sort of cuddling and feeding and changing babies, but like the really sort of heart wrenching thing about it was you knew these were the babies of the girls who'd already gone and they were left behind. And then you knew that when your baby came, that maybe your friends who weren't as far along in their pregnancy as you were would be holding your baby and you'd be gone. You know, but that was hard. That was really hard emotionally.
Could you ask someone to be there with you?
No. Like my labour was very difficult because my dad had been on the phone and he was sure, look, my dad didn't know anything about pregnancy or any of that, but he was saying that my mother was suffering from colitis, that he felt, you know, the stress was really, really getting to her, that it was an awful time, that it was a real struggle for them. He was worried about, you know, the cover story wearing pin, and was there anything they could do to speed it up and get me home quicker. There was literally no medical basis for that intervention at all. I sat up on the metal trolley and they put the drip into my arm. And I remember being there, like in the hours going by, watching the clock on the wall and the pain getting really strong and intense. The nurse. And I don't know what happened then. I remember I must have passed out. And it's all really blurry. And then her saying, you have a baby boy. And not remembering the actual moment of having him. So I don't know. All I know is I was basically cut open. Like, I don't mean an episiotomy, I mean cut open. And he was taken out by suction and forceps. I obviously lost a load of blood. And so as a result of that kind of blood loss, I wasn't let out of bed. And then I got out of bed and I saw him for the first time. That was when my parents came to bring me home. And they came in to the nursery just to look at him. And I can't remember my mother saying anything, but my father said he's a beautiful child. And I just told him I loved him and I put him back down in the cot. And I do remember after I went home kind of raising it again with my mother because I was distraught. I mean, I was utterly distraught. And I remember sobbing my heart out one night. And she heard me and came into my room and said, why are you crying? And I said, I mean, you really did wonder, like, do you need to ask? But I said, I miss my baby. And she said, sure, how could you miss him? You only knew him for 3 days.
So that's now the expectation on Deirdre, that this period in her life is not to be talked about, that it's just to be silence.
And it's a secret that only herself and her parents know. No one knows. When she walks down the street, no one knows what she's been through.
That's it. That's the deal. That's in order to atone for her sins, she has to just never speak of it. Did you go back to college? Like, how did your life just...
I did. I mean, he was born in June, mid-June, and I had to sit my exams in August. Internally, I was a complete and utter mess. And for me, one of the ways it played out was getting pregnant again.
And were you hoping it was going to be different?
Like, I don't talk a lot about this, Chris.
Yeah.
Initially, it was like a completely, like, really unwell thinking, which was that I was just going to have a baby, with this person, and we were going to run off into the sunset and, be a happy little family. And when it became a reality, everything just came crashing in. I really just.
I can't imagine Deirdre's in the same position again, it seems. And she found herself pregnant, I think, to maybe try solve some of the original difficulties.
Yeah, look at this point, she had plans, as she said. She was hoping it was all going to work out different. It all came crashing down, and she went back to this thing that she had to just drop everyone. She broke up with the boyfriend. She was all alone. And the secrecy thing, she was like, okay, I can do this in secret. That whole thing about keeping this in, not telling anyone. So she went to the Good Shepherd this time in Dunboyne. She was under strict instructions not to tell any of the girls this was her second pregnancy. As the language at the time was, she was now a second offender. I mean, it's really difficult to take it in. So she kept up a pretense that everything was okay in college, and she stayed in touch over the phone with her parents. But during one of these phone calls,
we got cut off, and she rang the exchange and said, "Can you give me the number?" Got cut off, talked to my daughter in the phone box, blah blah blah. Where is she ringing from? And he said, obviously, the Good Shepherd in Dunboyne. The next thing, the call rings back, and it was my mother, and I know where you are. And again, my kind of mother went into the kind of the very skilled kind of manipulation overdrive, out again of her own fear. Like, I'm not saying she was a bad person,
yeah,
but it was like, what if you keep this child, and then your first child comes looking for you in the future and finds out that you kept this child but not him? How's he going to feel? And that absolutely floored me.
So even though Deirdre's mother's attitude hadn't changed, Deirdre did feel that there was a better level of care for the pregnant women in the mother and baby home in Dunboyne. They had a better diet, they had exercise classes, they had proper maternity visits, doctor visits. So she did feel the women were being looked after a little bit better. But the outcome, nonetheless, was going to be just as difficult and heart-wrenching. Deirdre goes to the maternity hospital in Holles Street to have her baby.
So, like, after that child was born in Holles Street, basically the pattern there was one of the girls who was still pregnant, earlier in her pregnancy, would get the taxi in from Dunboyne to Holles Street, would meet you after you'd had your 3 days in hospital or whatever. You'd bring the baby, the two of you'd get back in the taxi, and then on the way back to Dunboyne, you stopped off at St. Patrick's home on the Navan Road, and you went to the back door, or the side door rather, and a nun would come to the side door and take the baby.
So you literally, the taxi stopped, you walked to the side door,
yeah,
and a nun met you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Deirdre's two sons were adopted, and she has been able to make contact with both of them. Deirdre now lives in Wexford with her partner and has 3 grown-up children. She helped nurse her mother through a battle with cancer, and her mother died in 1991, and her father passed away in 2014.
Deirdre, of course, also, like most survivors of the mother and baby homes, has not been impressed with the report that was recently published.
So I think that report really needs to be scrutinised, because as it stands, it's a slap in the face to survivors. Like, some of the stuff contained in it, the idea that there was no such thing as forced adoption is, it's just a basic untruth. It's a lie. It's clear that there were forced adoptions, and in many different forms, for mothers in those older times who did have their children just taken. I think they need to know where those children are. You spoke about the survivors, but so many children who didn't survive, and mothers who need answers. They need to know where their children are buried. That's just a basic human right. For the adult adoptees, they really need access to their information, all of their information, Like, everybody has a right to know who they are.
I think we can all agree with that. I think what all the survivors want is fair access to information about their time in these institutions. And it's essential that we hear the stories of these mothers and other survivors from the homes. But what about the men? How have the men that's been involved in all these pregnancies managed to melt away into the background?
Women who are pregnant, don't get pregnant by themselves. And some of the people who were responsible for getting women pregnant were rapists. Some of them were priests. Some of them were married men, maybe with positions of status or authority or power. And some of those people are still around who don't want things to come out. So there's a whole multifaceted set of reasons why maybe this isn't being tackled as full on as it should be.
One of the things that we mentioned at the beginning of this story was talking about how a published report can create this sense that what's under investigation, or what they're now talking about in a report, was something that happened in the past. It's finished. And we then walk around thinking, oh God, that was awful. But sure, that could never happen again, could it? But it does seem that there are still people out there who want to silence these survivors and to stop them from getting to the truth of their stories.
When I had an article in the journal, I happened to mention my experience, the first experience in Bessborough, and, referred to that 13-year-old girl in terms of, like, nobody should ever have put her through that. And, like, the way you get all the comments afterwards. And there were loads of supportive comments, but there were one or two negative comments, very judgmental comments. One was like, how is she strong? She gave up her own child. Now, that was the comment that I couldn't get out of my head. That was the comment that kind of bore its way into my mind and into my heart and into my emotions. That's when you realise you're not as well as you think you are.
If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this podcast, please reach out to a professional counselling service or check the links on our website.
I just really want to thank Deirdre Wadding for sharing that story. It's not an easy thing to do, and really, really appreciate the time that Deirdre gave us.
No one intervened on behalf of...
Hedge Radio is a Crannog Media production brought to you by me, Alan Boland.
And me, Chris Hayes.
Find us at crannogmedia.ie.
Please tell your friends and subscribe to Hedge Radio wherever you get your podcasts, and never miss a story.
Find us on Instagram, DM us at Crannog Films, or send us an email at podcast@crannogmedia.ie.
This episode was not sponsored by the Sisters of Secours.